it's probably not other people that will harm you on the moon. It's the lunar surface itself. And the ability to coordinate, to have interoperability so you can help each other out in case of emergency. I think those really practical life and death on the moon issues can help bring us together, provide a really good starting ground for having discussion, because it's not going to be easy and accidents inevitably happen.
Hey Space Watchers, and welcome back to another Space Cafe Radio. And today I have a good friend of Space Watch on the table on the other side of the Atlantic, but still on the table. And that is Dr. Jessica West, senior researcher at the Project Ploughshares in Canada. And she just came back from the OS25, the Outer Space Security Conference at UNIDIR in Geneva, where she also moderated one of the panels. So, Jessica, freshly back home. So how are you doing?
A little sleepy, but also I have a notebook full of factual points, wonderful statements, different points of views that I took away from the conference. So I'm excited to review that and take that forward into my work and hopefully the work of others. So tired but happy is a good way to say it.
That's great. So, that was not your first outer space conference at UNIDIR. What changed this year? So maybe you can set the stage for us in what is the state of the global space security and what stood out to you this year in terms of process and outcomes.
So I'm going to date myself a little bit by mentioning that my very first outer space security conference, I think it was 2007. And what has changed since then, which is quite a long time, is back then the conference was really focused on explaining what outer space security was, why it's important. So trying to raise awareness about space as a security topic within the diplomatic and expert community. And we are so far beyond that now. And I think that is a major change. Space is on pretty much every state's radar, big or small, north or south. And it's on the radar of experts and diplomats who might be more focused on other areas of technology, but understand increasingly that they interact with outer space. So the big change this year, I think, was I'm going to use the word inclusivity of the discussion, but I mean that in many different ways. And so one way is topic-wise. I think there were two new topics on the table that have never been there, cis-lunar space security, and then the panel that I moderated on unpredictability in outer space, which ended up focusing quite heavily on the strategic security level, especially the nexus and linkages with nuclear security and stability issues. And I think that is remarkable because it showed in some ways how hard our task is because of the complexity and the breadth of space security, but also how important it is because of the entanglement with all of these other security issues. And so having a venue like UNIDIR where you can have an open, safe, and rather intimate place to have high-level discussions, expert discussions, and bring those voices together that are often siloed, I think that's really valuable and would be irreplaceable if we weren't able to continue doing that. So I was glad to be there, not only because of the wonderful people, but because of the substance that was on the agenda.
That's great to hear. And you have been on number of conferences before, not just the OS conferences. I'm pointing to the open-ended working groups where you not always came back with a lot of energy and hope. Let's put it
so
that way.
Live tweeting is draining, and then hope is a whole other issue. And I think UNIDIR was able to pick up where a rather unusual open-ended working group meeting in July left off, and pull some of those strands together that are left dangling in terms of voices, who's going to be at the table, who's going to be represented, what does it mean to talk about both norms and legally binding initiatives in the same room, in the same conference, and look at the same topics, and how do we build a positive atmosphere out of what started off as a pretty rocky initiative where the first meeting really didn't take place and was bogged down in procedural debates. So I'll applaud Unideer. It's a big conference in some ways, and yet it always feels intimate and it's a safe place. And that's evident if anyone wants to look back and watch the videos by the diversity of people asking questions from young and old, space experts to non-space experts. And I think that's where you get a lot of aha moments, because it breaks you out of your own day-to-day thinking.
That's great. What I recognized from the distance watching a few of the sessions was that Unideer, Office for Outer Space Affairs, and ITU came together more closer. And we saw that at the recent UN Copius earlier this summer in Vienna, where they all also had a common offsite meeting to talk how they try to collaborate more than before. And I think from an institutional view, that's great to see that they try to overcome these silos from who's doing what in space and where, and now doing it more together. At least that's the sense that I could get from the outside. I don't know how you have seen it, but at least to have the three leaders of the organizations are on one stage is remarkable.
Yeah, that was the opening keynote. We had Artie from the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, obviously linked to Copius on the peaceful side, and we had a representative from the ITU, and we were missing ODA, the Office for Disarmament Affairs. We had a virtual remarks from Izumi, which were wonderful. You know, I've written a lot on the gray zones of space governance, as you might know, and I think a lot of the gray zone happens in the gaps between these different bodies where you have topics that fall between them. And jamming is a great one. And use of spectrum overall and management of spectrum, that is a sustainability issue because it's a limited resource. It's a safety issue for flight, but also the ability to have reliable access to your space systems, which are often linked to really life and death issues here on Earth, aviation being one of them. And you have the security side where there is a military carve out, and it can be hard to tell what is intentional, what is not intentional, what is intentional but made to look not intentional. And so I do think having the voices together where we can sort out, carve up action so that it can be coordinated and collective, but join the pieces together is really important. And so that we stop forum blocking, which I think has been a really big problem, where you say we can't talk about space debris in a security sense because that's being dealt with at Copius, and yet there are issues that are very much related to security, such as weapon systems. And so being able to close those gaps, I think, is going to be essential. And that came out in the program as well, where you see that there's issues that just cut across different institutions. So again, bravo for bringing people who aren't normally part of the security discussion into the security discussion.
And I think that's a trend that we see on all of these three sides, just to leave them here. So in a few weeks from now, there is the ITU, our sustainability conference, also a focus on the space side. And as you said, it's tackled at the moment from multiple angles. But let's dive into what really happened. So let us start a bit on the legal and doctrinal hurdles, especially day 2, the morning sessions on definitions and doctrines here, and the debates about due regards and peaceful purposes. These debates around these two terms show how much interpretation still diverges. How serious is this challenge for building common ground?
I think it's one of the most challenging aspects of space security that we face, because without shared interpretation of what the principles mean in practice, it's hard to have the practice that sustains security. And it's hard to have accountability as well if there are different expectations or standards. And I think this is really one of the key areas that the normative side of the open-ended working group discussion can fill in. The question is their political will. And that is one thing that I do worry about, because interpretation is key to the law and the diplomacy and the doctrinal side of space security. And yet we heard at the July meeting in Geneva that Russia didn't think interpreting principles was part of the mandate of the meeting, and was suggesting that interpretation depends on every single specific incident. And that means you can't have common understanding or general practices if you adopt that interpretation of legal principles such as due regard. And I'm hoping we can work beyond that. Maybe we just have to frame it differently. Again, we might be having translation issues about what we mean in practice, what we're trying to do at the diplomatic level. But I think having that dialogue where you can have agreement on how at least individual states interpret their obligations and what they will do to implement it is core to what the UK has been trying to do on the space security side and that portion of the open-ended working group. And I think it's key to the law side as well. I don't see these as two separate issues. I think they're two sides of the same coin. You know, if we're trying to talk about banning weapons in space, a lot of that is interpreting what is a weapon and not being able to interpret that or interpreting it very differently, which is, I think, what we've been seeing in a finger pointing type of way is part of where we're stuck and part of where we're not making progress and spinning wheels while technology and doctrines race way ahead of us.
But we're talking here at a time where we see an escalation of rhetoric and escalation of actions in space. And now, especially in space, in low Earth orbit for the time being. So do you see that there's still positive, forward-looking, peaceful activities on Earth that lead to an agreement, a consensus, how we might walk into the future when it comes to space? Or will we have to live with the uncertainty of the status quo? I'm not questioning your job, your work.
No, of course not. You're asking where the hope is. And I think we're seeing hope and constructive dialogue on the peaceful side of outer space. And so lunar coordination issues, resource issues, you are seeing the establishment of new working groups at the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. I think that's hopeful and valuable and is something to hang on to. Security is harder. Where I see the source of progress and optimism is at the majority of states in the middle who are committed to advancing a comprehensive approach to security. So that's almost every state, as far as I can tell, who see the value of having norms of behavior to prevent escalation, to prevent conflict, and also see the value of more traditional arms control to prevent some of the most heinous weapons that we might place in orbit and which could have such a destabilizing effect either at the strategic level or the environmental level that it is in everyone's interest to ban them. And I think most states see the value of both of these approaches and the logic of working together. And so having meetings like the open-ended working group where every state has a voice is important to keep bringing that balanced and rational voice into the room that can cut through some of the political tension that, let's face it, is related to space, but it's also so much more than that right now. And I'm also glad that we keep plucking away at this. Things might look unstable and almost impossible. And yet we know from the past that you need to have the groundwork laid in advance for when the right political moment comes. And you don't know when that will be. I'm hoping it's not a crisis or something dreadful that happens that forces the community to take serious action. I'm really hoping that it's more of a political opening and a common security or global protection moment that we have. That might sound incredulous now, but I think when you look back, we never know when these times are going to change. I think where we are today compared to where we were a year ago at OS 24, so much has happened politically. All we can depend on is change, right? And unpredictability, and having the groundwork laid to cope with it, I think is really helpful. I'm an optimist, Torsten. You can work in my field and not be an optimist and not see hope.
I think we have been there and we had this conversation every time we speak together. I would like to pick up on the cis-lunar governance and dual use risks that you pointed to earlier. Let's start with resource extraction, autonomous systems, mining on the moon, nuclear on the moon. OS 24 highlighted growing concerns here. And are we moving closer to multilateral frameworks, or are bilateral deals like the Artemis Accords still dominating?
I think it's positive that the discussion is moved formally into the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And I think some of this is a misnomer when it comes to trying to slot things like the Artemis Accord into a specific category. I think it's unique in many ways. It's bilateral, and yet you have states from all regions participating. I think it's a bit of a hybrid, but you're right. It hasn't been formally discussed in the United Nations. I think it did an important task of outlining what the issues are for discussion and putting some approach to it on the table, which gives states an opportunity to discuss and react, in addition to the work that others have done, such as the building block effort. And so I think what is valuable is that the working group's not starting from scratch, and that might speed things up. I also think we're lacking, though, some bilateral discussion across approaches. And there's a lot of focus on the Artemis Accords. I think China, for the first time last year, released some of their thinking on this, and that is really valuable. And understanding where there's common thinking and where there might be divergent thinking across some of the big players that are most likely to reach the lunar surface earlier than later is valuable. And more of that, I think, would be helpful. Not in a confrontational way, but even at the high level of how do we expect to conduct ourselves? What are we concerned about? How can we coordinate? The moon is hard. What I loved about that panel at Unidir was the statement that it's probably not other people that will harm you on the moon, it's the lunar surface itself. And the ability to coordinate, to have interoperability so you can help each other out in case of emergency. I think those really practical life and death on the moon issues can help bring us together, provide a really good starting ground for having discussion, because it's not going to be easy and accidents inevitably happen. And being able to rescue one another, provide mutual aid, I think is the foundation of doing any kind of work in extreme environments. We've seen the same in the Antarctic. Doesn't mean all the other issues fall away, but you have to start somewhere.
I like your Canadian positivity on that matter. And staying on the moon, so how dual use risks in cis-lunar space or on the moon complicate security and trust?
I suppose dual use and dual purpose technologies is one area. I think what is challenging is the slippery line between military and non-military on the moon and around the moon. And Antonio pointed this out really well. The Outer Space Treaty has a fairly clear standard whereby there's no military activity on the moon, and then it spells out very specific exceptions when it comes to personnel. And Antonio was quite firm. He thinks that peaceful means peaceful and it means non-military. And I think keeping that distinction and trying to avoid too much dual use in terms of joint military and civilian programs or joint military and civilian capabilities is going to be important for keeping that open, for avoiding security dilemma on the moon and mistrust on the moon. And I think where we're getting slippery is the cis-lunar space, where you're not on the lunar surface, but perhaps bringing a security or military perspective to those civilian activities. So the sense that they might need protection. That's why I really valued the point that it's the moon itself that is the most dangerous. We didn't really get to talk about that too much. I've seen a few people are starting to write about it. Again, it's not just a security issue. I think there's fundamental questions for the people who will be there and for the environment itself about the sustainability and safety issues of nuclear power. And I think transparency in terms of openness, information sharing, and engagement is one of the most important things that actors can do to build trust and confidence by others. And we had a great discussion about that. What does transparency mean? And it's not just sharing information. Transparency is a process, and it requires engaging and respecting the questions of others. And I really liked that part of the discussion, bringing the C back to the T, the transparency and confidence building. And I think it's that confidence building that's more action-oriented that we really have to keep at the forefront of diplomacy.
I would like to stick on the moon and talk with you about a very practical approach, because staying on the moon makes it more easier now in following your definition. A few weeks back, we had Barbie Alal on our Space Café podcast with Marcus, and she talked about the development of the nuclear reactor on the moon that was supposed to go up there. And I'm not one to talk about the technology now, but about the security framing. And that comes then back to the Artemis Accord. And that's the non-military side. But we're talking about security, because safety zones will be called out when you put a reactor on the moon, that no one comes too close for human and for whatever practical security reasons. So how to deal with that? And that is a classical dual-use technology, in my view, where you don't have a military needed to be there, but you need a kind of enforcement of the security and safety.
Yeah, I guess, to do what though? Sometimes there's the hypothetical and then there's the practical in terms of what would you do with the security side of it on the moon that you couldn't do in other ways and that would make sense. And so I'm a fan of Levin Bowen's work, which is that, yes, you can talk about military interests sometimes, but often it's the impracticality that we forget about. And the moon is not all that strategic, at least from a military perspective. And we might have to convince some actors of that. Reality, I hope, will kick in. But I think safety zones is a really interesting one. And it came up a little bit in the discussion, but it reminded me of the work that McGill is going to be doing under the direction of Andrea Harrison. And her student Martina was there presenting on the project on language that they're doing. And I think looking at the language of the safety zone and how it's interpreted in different languages, it might not even have meaning in some languages, could be really valuable to understand how different actors are thinking about this and what they see as the meaning and the implications and how it will work. And I think language could be a way to start that conversation, not at a political level, but at a meaning, a sense of meaning. And then what kind of meaning are we ascribing to it from different linguistic perspectives? And I would love to see that happen, that project go forward. Of course, they have to finish their first project, which is linguistic interpretations of the Outer Space Treaty. But I think starting with what's in place legally and then thinking about some of the ideas that are newly emerging could be really useful. And from a non-political perspective, you can start to flag where those issues might be, where we need to do work on explaining or changing nuance or even changing practice so that we don't have mistrust and misinterpretation. Because I have no idea what this means. One side of my head raises a red flag. Ding, ding, this is not a good idea. This sounds like appropriation or this sounds like exclusivity. And then the other side is also aware of the really practical challenges of operating on the moon and the need to have processes in place that can prevent safety issues. I hate dust in my house, but lunar dust is a whole different issue. And I think the fragility of human life in such a remote and in many ways hostile environment is something we have to take seriously.
Let's jump into your panel that you moderated, the strategic unpredictability. From your moderator's seat, and I think you have been in this unique position this year to be a moderator and not just a panelist, so you could direct the entire flea circus.
They don't always listen.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Welcome to my world as a moderator. But what struck you most in this debate on doctrines like space superiority and the taboo of weapons in space?
First, I just want to give a shout out to my panelists, Rishan, Laura Grego, Sarah Erickson, James Black, and Andre. I'm going to get his last name used, but one of the first people I met from the diplomatic space community. They were fantastic, and it was a riveting conversation. I was surprised, but perhaps I should not have been, by how much Golden Dome dominated that discussion, because it is both a strategic issue, and yet there are so many other strategic issues that we have to be thinking about and so many other sources of unpredictability. So I like that Sarah Erickson brought that reminder back to us that space has its own dedicated sources of unpredictability that aren't linked to nuclear necessarily and that aren't linked to missile defense in Earth, but definitely dominated what we were talking about. In some ways, it was like a flashback because this discussion about space superiority and dominance, that's not new. It certainly goes back to U.S. doctrine, probably at least 2011, probably further back than that. And the weapons taboo is also not new. So I think what stood out was the sense of urgency, the sense that we're on the precipice of change and change that might be irreversible when it comes to this fundamental goal of preventing an arms race in outer space. That really struck me as heartfelt. And if people want to go back and listen to Andre's remarks at the end of that panel, I think they really summed up the concern that we're facing. One thing that I wanted to talk about more, and I was trying to press my colleague Dr. Wu a little bit, was the dual purpose linkage to the weapons taboo. And yes, we don't want space weapons in space. yes, space-based interceptors would probably be a very clear example of a weapon system in space and definitely shatter that taboo that I think we've been dancing around for a long time. And so I guess a concern that I would have is you can also erode it through 1,000 little cuts related to dual purpose capabilities where you're possibly testing elements of a weapons capability or elements that could be repurposed for a weapons capability and shrouding it under peaceful use because of the taboo. And Dr. Wu mentioned that, but I wanted to dive into it more. You can shatter it with a sledgehammer, but I do think you can bleed it to death slowly over time and suddenly realize that it's gone. So I would have pressed him more on that, but we were short on time because there were so many things to talk about. I was also a little surprised by the United States was rather quiet at this event. I will say I didn't see the Canadians there at all. And I know that the Conference on Disarmament was also meeting, which ran a lot of these diplomats off their feet this week. So kudos for those who were able to make it and participate. But that silence, I think, is something that we're still grappling with. And I think it does speak again to this moment of uncertainty. And I would rather states take their time. Time was a big theme, and the lack of time, the sense of a lack of time on my panel was a big theme. Finding space to take time and think carefully, I think, is valuable. And silence isn't always a negative thing. Sometimes silence is reflection or trying to find a way, I hope. But I will give a shout out as well to the United States who helped fund the conference once again. And honestly, that kind of funding that cuts across geographical and geopolitical perspectives, that's part of the process. That's part of the value. So I had a great time. I think my panelists were fantastic. There was so much more to talk about. And I think where do we go from here is something that all of the panelists struggled a little bit with, other than saying we shouldn't put weapons in space. Wow, that takes us back to these issues that we're grappling with. What is a weapon? How do we know? How do we build confidence that other systems aren't weapons? What do we do when we call maneuvers by one state dogfighting, but call maneuvers by our own state defense and security? Again, that takes us back to your first question on interpretation.
Now, and you mentioned the interceptor topic. The Golden Dome has clearly in the architecture interceptors in. We can't deny that. We also see that other countries are looking for, as they call it, offensive space capabilities. Last but not least, not talking about the on-orbit servicing capabilities that getting more and more advanced. You call it dogfighting, but others say it's servicing or deservicing others.
Or synchronized dance might be more of an accurate description than dogfighting, but okay.
Absolutely. Okay.
I think that's a really good point. And I have spoken to people from many different countries about this, from militaries as well. And my sense is that states feel fundamentally insecure in outer space and are trying to take steps to protect themselves. And so I think we're in a security dilemma right now because those steps in turn have a reaction by others because they now feel insecure. And that is just embedded in the dual purpose nature of the technology where your ability to protect yourself also means you probably have an ability to harm others. And so finding our way out of that security dilemma will be essential. But I don't see arms racing right now for many states anyways, or the thinking about military capabilities in space, weapons, whether they be offensive or defensive, as a desire to have an arms race. I do feel it as a response to a fundamental sense of insecurity. And yet we can't address that if we can't have empathy and recognition of the security needs that everyone else has. And we're just not there right now. So this is a really prickly issue. And I do appreciate the states that are leaning more into non-kinetic means of security, focusing on transparency, better awareness, better communication measures. I think there's a lot we could do to tone down the rhetoric and to create spaces for dialogue, even just the ability to have a hotline and say, hey, that looks weird. What are you doing? And maybe clarify intentions a little bit would be useful. Again, I think this is where the open-ended working group can play a really big role.
Okay. You mentioned at the beginning the inclusivity this year, and from the videos I saw really a huge number of younger people there. How significant is that younger or more diverse voices are shaping these discussions? Is inclusivity moving from rhetoric to reality? Or is it still, hey, nice to have you here, but...
I think it requires intentionality, and certainly the intentionality at this conference is there in full force. And it wasn't just the youth winners, who are absolutely phenomenal. When I first started doing this conference back in 2007, I was a much younger person, and I was not nearly as well equipped to grapple with the issues as I see people are today. So if people haven't seen the youth videos, please watch it. Sarah Erickson will admit it brought a tear to her eye. It is inspirational. And that participation, though, was really there in the questions that were asked of panelists. I think young people weren't shy to put up their placards and ask a question. And it's not just nice to have. It can help break us out of some of these circular thinking patterns of dialogue that we've been stuck in and help you imagine a different way forward. Why can't we prioritize intergenerational access to space and security? That framing might be a less political way of thinking about some of our security issues. And certainly they affect everybody. We're all going to have future generations and we all want them to be well. Views on innovation and technology, the excitement for innovation and technology, but the fact that that depends on a peaceful space environment. Okay, let's talk about the value of innovation and how do we do it in a way that can maintain peace. I think coming at the issues from different perspectives can help the dialogue progress. It also gives diplomats and experts in the room different ideas to comment on. So again, we don't have the same discussion every single year. So I think it really brings the difference, the innovation, the new ideas, and the liveliness, as well as the hope to the room. I thought it was great. And I enjoyed meeting everyone, as well as colleagues that I've known for a long time. I think it's that intergenerational nature that also makes it enjoyable, brings value. And again, I think I ended my first remarks there with, instead of commenting, let's go have dinner. I was standing between everyone in that room and dinner time. And I did much better the second year, and I had great people help me learn how to navigate that room. I just feel that young people today don't need as much help. They're so incredibly talented and dedicated.
I think that's what every generation says about the upcoming one.
I don't know, maybe in other issues we're like, oh, they just don't understand.
I think that it's great to see the capabilities of the next generation and that are coming always. So it's so much more than what we all have been able to learn in our lifetime to this point. But let's look ahead. What happens after Geneva? So how do we ensure these debates on norms, doctrines, and governance translate into concrete policy on the UN, in Europe, and globally?
I think that depends on people in the room bringing the conversations home. And I've had a lot of discussions with people who will argue that international law, it's not that impactful. There's no global police, so it doesn't mean anything. Or how do you ensure that norms are implemented and abided by? And the answer is deceptively simple. It happens at the national level with regulation, domestic policy, domestic spending priorities, processes. That's where it gets legal expression, and that's where the adherence comes from. That's built into the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6. And so I think when it comes to these discussions, it's really people bringing what they heard back home and finding where the source of that implementation is. And so diffusion would be the way that it has an impact. And I'm also thinking the open-ended working group will have some positive takeaways from this because they had that opportunity on the more diplomatic panel to talk about what does this dual track approach mean in practice. And I think my question was misinterpreted, and point to everybody, misinterpretation is possible with the best of intentions. But I asked about the dual track approach that was adopted in the agenda, where it's structured in terms of this part of the day is legally binding, this part of the day is reserved for non-legally binding. But what I see is the duplication of topics because they connect. And I think we're going to have an opportunity to connect some of these issues from both a legal and a non-legal perspective. So civilian protection, we can have legal standards, but putting them into practice might be more of a normative issue and a behavioral issue. And so I think there's going to be a lot of value of looking at these topics from two different perspectives. And I'm hoping that the panelists on the diplomatic session that was hosted are also trying to see where there's going to be scope for progress. Also, what's happening? I think that's valuable. We don't always have the luxury of multilateral discussions on really important issues. And so kudos to the diplomats who pushed through and made that happen and found compromise. Not always everyone's first option that wins out, but finding a way to move forward that keeps everyone in the room, that has empathy for the different perspectives, that's really the starting point. And let's remember that NGOs will be there next time.
Absolutely. So now there's still some work, That's how it sounds.
We're at the beginning.
That's it.
We're building on some foundations.
Oh, yes.
In terms of the scope and the meat that has been put onto this program, I think it's exciting. And that's why I say we're at the beginning, because they're going to talk about some really tough and substantial issues: protection of civilians, weapons in space, rendezvous and proximity, which from another perspective is operational safety obligations. This is the heart of space security, and that is on the agenda.
Dr. Jessica West, it was, as always, a great honor to talk to you and have your views, your recap from these events. You bring in so much value in that and connect the dots for many of us out in the audience or here with you in the room. Thank you very much.
That's very kind of you to say. And I think collectively, we're lucky to have a pretty wonderful space community. So that includes all the people listening.
With that, SpaceWatch out. Bye. If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.